Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 200. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode, I'm celebrating the 200th episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm also celebrating the podcast's 5-year anniversary since the first episode went live on the various podcast platforms. There have been so many wonderful guest authors who have visited the Bookshop to discuss their books and their writing journeys. In this episode, however, I'm going to do something a little different. In fact, I'm going to do something that I have never done in any of the prior 199 episodes. Today, I'm going to talk about my own books, my own writing journey, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Thank you for joining me for the 200th episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I began this podcast 5 years ago with the goal of helping book lovers discover new authors. I love hearing authors talk about their books, where they came up with their ideas, and why they feel compelled to write. The goal of this podcast has been to provide a forum for authors to discuss their work in their own words, to give them an opportunity to chat about the art and craft of writing, and to share what it's been like for them on their writing journey. In creating this podcast, my hope was that readers would listen to the podcast, discover an author that intrigued them, and pick up a copy of their book, either to read themselves or to share with a friend. 5 years later, this is still my hope. If you haven't listened to all 199 episodes that came before this one, feel free to do so. I recommend scrolling back through the list of episodes, including the older ones in the archives, and have a listen. The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Browse around. With so many episodes available to you, you never know what treasures you might find. As I mentioned in my introduction, I have never spoken about my own books on this podcast. In fact, I have shared very little of my own writing journey. That has been intentional. My focus has always been on helping other authors reach new readers. But as this is my 200th episode, I decided to be bold, to go a little crazy, and to finally talk about myself. Why not? It is my podcast after all. So let's begin at the beginning. Don't worry, we're not going all the way back to my childhood. In fact, my writing journey didn't begin until I was in my early 30s and well into my professional legal career. Yes, I was a lawyer in my prior life. I practiced for just shy of 20 years, with most of that time spent practicing corporate and contract law as in-house counsel for a large multinational corporation. When I stopped practicing, I began writing in earnest. But I started writing in the first place because I was starved for creativity in my work. I liked my job. I was reasonably good at it, but it wasn't very creative, at least not in the ways that I needed it to be in my life. I knew I would have to find it outside work, so I went searching. But a lot of art forms are off the table for me. I am no artist. I cannot draw, paint, or sculpt. Stick figures are about the extent of my artistic ability, and even that is a stretch. I cannot sing to save my life. I have never been able to play any musical instruments, despite having tried on several occasions in my youth. And frankly, my dancing days are well behind me. So that left writing. This was something I had never really been interested in. I had written some when I was in school as a kid, and I enjoyed it. It was fine, but I was not drawn to it. At least I don't have any memories of that. Since I was desperate at this stage, I decided to give it a shot. I began small, with a simple story idea. I wrote it out longhand on a legal notepad while sitting at my desk during my lunch breaks. I didn't get very far with that very first story because it morphed into the story that would eventually become book 1 of my young adult adventure series. Writing became my new hobby and eventually a passion. I had been spending my days, sometimes my nights, and many of my weekends being a lawyer, but creative writing spoke to the wannabe artist inside of me. So I kept writing. The first book I finished was actually the third book I published, but I'd like to start with it because it is really where all of this began. I had an idea for a young adult series that would feature a brother and sister team, as well as the grandfather and a few other supporting characters. When I began, I had a vague idea of how it would all come together, but what I quickly learned is that characters often take over, and my plans would be thrown out the window. That first book took me 12 years to write and rewrite over and over again. It became the first book in my YA series, the Elixir Vitae Adventures. The series opens with Abigail and Quinn Link, the brother and sister, arriving at their grandfather's house after the death of their mother. The siblings never knew their father, so their grandfather is now their only relative. He enrolls them in the prestigious Belvedere Academy, and after a rocky start, they eventually make a few friends as well as a few enemies. Abigail and Quinn also learn that their grandfather leads a double life. He is a professor at Paladin College, located across the street from Belvedere Academy, but he is also an adventurer who is trying to find the elusive Elixir Vitae, also known as the Elixir of Life, that magical substance that grants immortality. But their grandfather is not the only one searching for the Elixir Vitae, nor is he hoping to find it for himself. Quite the opposite, in fact. He and a small group of allies are part of a secret society called the Immortalis, which is charged with keeping the Elixir Vitae safely hidden from everyone, including its own members. Why keep it hidden? Well, because the Elixir Vitae is very dangerous and not entirely what it seems. Abigail and Quinn join their grandfather as he begins searching for the Elixir Vitae, because someone else has learned of its existence and is actively seeking it. And this person does not have humanity's best interests at heart. There are 5 books in this series, with each one taking Abigail and Quinn, their grandfather, and eventually their friends, on crazy adventures around the world. There are elements of magic included in the series, primarily the use of portal maps, which magically transport the user to various locations around the world. There's also lots of intrigue and long-held family secrets, but it's also a book about friendship and family, how those things can take multiple forms, and how they are not always easy and straightforward. Book 1 takes the team to various locations around the United States. Book 2 focuses on Europe, Book 3 Africa, Book 4 South America, and Book 5 Asia. The 5 books are also titled using the Latin words for 5 stages of life: ortus, juvenus, adultus, senectus, and mortem, which mean birth, youth, adulthood, old age, and death. Authors often say that there's a little bit of themselves in most, if not all, of their characters. That's definitely the case with Abigail. Of all the characters in the series, she is the most like me. She is shy and nervous and a perfectionist and easily overwhelmed. Her brother, Quinn, is sort of a combination of both my brother and my sister. Not wholly, but at least in part. He is outgoing and likable and popular, sporty, but he's also incredibly smart, very, very bright. My favorite character, however, across the series, and even across probably all of my books, is Victoria. She becomes Abigail's best friend, and she is mouthy and brash and quick-tempered. But she's also a fierce and loyal friend, and I just loved writing that character. I found myself eagerly awaiting any scene I could put her in. So she was probably the most fun to write in that series. I was originally inspired to write these books because I was stuck behind a desk, working long hours, taking very little time off, let alone going to any place exciting. I wanted to travel. I wanted to have adventures. And since I couldn't at that time, I decided to write about it to hopefully live a bit vicariously through my characters. It took me a long time to finish the series, about 17 years, in fact, from beginning that very first story through to publishing the fifth and final book. The series is near and dear to my heart because it started me on this path and has been with me throughout pretty much my entire writing journey. Finishing the series was bittersweet, and I wasn't sure, when it happened, how I would feel about those characters no longer running around in my head and begging for more adventures on the page. But as every author probably can attest, that vacancy doesn't last long, and new stories have now filled the void. New characters have taken the place of the old ones, and there are new voices now chattering away in my imagination. While I enjoyed writing the Elixir Vitae Adventures, I will admit that they are not my favorite books. I love them, but they aren't my favorites, and there are several reasons for that. First, Ortus, Book 1, is probably my most heavily edited book, and as a result, it is the one I feel least connected to. It was handled by a number of different editors. Some I liked, some I didn't. But the end product is something that doesn't feel entirely my own, and there are probably authors out there that can relate to that feeling. In later books, I found more of a rhythm. I found editors that I worked well with, and the result is books 2 through 4 are better. My writing got better, the editing got better, the books are just better. So if you pick up the series, don't stop at book 1. Keep going, please. Another reason they aren't my favorite is because I found in subsequent books that what I really enjoyed were mysteries and thrillers. And while there are some elements of that in the Elixir Vitae Adventures, it's really more of an adventure series for young adults. All of the other books that I published are more mysteries and thrillers, and I think that is probably what I will stick with going forward. Another reason they aren't necessarily my favorites is in the books, the characters age as the books progress. With each book, they get a year older. And I found that the later books, say books 4 and 5, I was enjoying more because the characters were a bit older. So while I liked writing for young adults, my preference, I think, is for writing for a slightly older audience. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But I discovered that I think my voice as an author is not necessarily for younger teens or for children. It's for older teens and adults. I mentioned that Ortus, Book 1 of the Elixir Vitae Adventures, was the first book I wrote. And by that, I mean the first to be completed, edited, read by others, etc. But it was actually my third book published. The first book of mine to be published was another young adult novel, Sycamore Lane. It began as a simple writing exercise, actually. It was meant to be a short story that I wrote just to clear my head so that I could then go back to continue editing Ortus. But when I began writing, one page turned into 2, and that turned into 10, and eventually it became a whole book. My husband and I were living in New York at the time. We lived just outside of New York City in an old 2-story house on a street lined with sycamore trees. When we moved into that house, there was a small bedroom upstairs that had been a kid's room. One of the walls was painted floor to ceiling with chalkboard paint. And on that wall, someone had written in chalk, "Happy Moving Day," with an exclamation mark. About 6 months after we moved in, we met the prior owners of the house at a neighbor's Christmas party. We told them that we were enjoying the house, and my husband mentioned the note on the chalkboard wall. Well, the prior owners looked at us like we were crazy and said that neither of them nor their kids had written it. And at that point, I had an idea for a story. What if there was a ghost in our house? And what if the ghost decided to start communicating with us by writing messages on our chalkboard wall? That was the inspiration for Sycamore Lane. So in this novel, 14-year-old Tallulah moves into the house at 19 Sycamore Lane, only to discover that the house is haunted. The ghost begins leaving her messages on the chalkboard wall, and while Tallulah is admittedly freaked out by the occurrence, she begins to strike up a friendship with this ghost, who she learns is named Anastasia. But Anastasia's messages also come with a warning. Someone has been harming the kids who lived in that house, and they will come for Tallulah next. So Tallulah must decide who to trust, and she must uncover the truth about what has happened to the kids who came before her before she meets the same fate. Sycamore Lane is the only book I have pantsed from start to finish. I had the initial premise for the story, as I mentioned, and nothing more. So I showed up each day to write, and I wondered if the story would show up too. I had no idea what would happen, no plan for the plot or the characters, and no inkling of how it would end. It might be the most fun I've had writing a book, but it was also the scariest. One, because the story has a ghost and a haunted house and someone terrorizing teenagers, and two, because I was never sure if I'd make it to the end of the story to find out what happened. When I sat down to write, I was never certain that the story would join me. Perhaps it would abandon me. That was a real possibility. It felt sort of like a trust fall exercise. Would the story catch me as I fell into it? As it turns out, it did. I made it to the end, and the book Sycamore Lane is the result. Oh, and I should mention that the house I lived in was not haunted. At least I saw no evidence of that. But it made for a really good setting for the story. Now, the second book I published is another young adult novel titled Inland. It's about a young woman named Kat, short for Katrina, who receives a surprise gift from her friends Rebecca and Fallon for her 18th birthday. The surprise is a trip to an alternate universe called Inland. And with a passport issued from a secret government agency, you can travel there by special train from a seemingly deserted platform in Grand Central Terminal in the heart of New York City. The train takes you to Inland, where you arrive at the same platform in a version of New York City that is just a bit different from our own. In Inland, everyone has an identical, the version of themselves that exists in that universe. They look like us, they sound like us, but their personality is really the opposite of ours. So if you are meek and mild, your identical may be boisterous and domineering. If you are outgoing and adventurous, your identical may be shy and fearful, and so on. Kat, Rebecca, and Fallon board the train at platform 101 and travel to New York City in Inland with the hope of meeting their identicals. One of the benefits of traveling to Inland from our world is that you can meet your identical without fear of being recognized. We are able to recognize them, but they do not see us for who we are. At least that is how it is supposed to work. There are a few exceptions to that rule, a few inlanders who have the ability to recognize their counterparts. When Kat meets her identical, Katrina, she discovers that Katrina is one of these anomalies. Katrina instantly recognizes Kat and does not take kindly to being gawked at like some sort of tourist attraction. While Kat is mild-mannered and good-natured, Katrina is anything but. And Katrina makes it her mission to travel back to Kat's world and give her a taste of her own medicine. Katrina makes several trips from Inland to Kat's world, wreaking havoc and trying to systematically destroy Kat's life. This leaves Kat with no choice but to become as ruthless as her identical in order to save her reputation and perhaps even her life. Inspiration for this book came from two sources. The first was a dream I had, a very vivid dream about one particular scene in the book. All I knew was that there was an alternate universe, and a woman had traveled there to a jazz club to see her identical. The woman was very much a wallflower, just all in black, fades into the background. Their counterpart is the jazz singer on stage with gorgeous hair and a sparkling dress, and really the exact opposite of the first woman. And that's all I knew. It was so vivid. I knew there was a story here, but I didn't know anything more than that. The second source of inspiration came from Grand Central. As I mentioned, my husband and I lived just outside of Manhattan, and we would travel by train into the city, to and from Grand Central. There was, and perhaps still is, a platform on the lower level, number 101, that was unused. There was never any train coming into or leaving from platform 101. And it got me thinking, What could such a platform be used for? One that is just abandoned? Well, of course, it would make the perfect location for a portal to an alternate universe. It seems only logical, right? I started with that simple notion, and the story unfurled from there. While riding inland, my husband and I spent a fair bit of time in Grand Central and touring around Manhattan as part of my research. He will attest to me dragging him everywhere. The places I describe in the book, the streets, the parks, the buildings, all of them exist. Central Park, the public library at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, even the Blue Jay Jazz Club. Although, full disclosure, there was, and perhaps still is, a red building with black awnings on the relevant corner in Greenwich Village. But it isn't the Blue Jay Jazz Club. The last time I checked, I think it was a burger joint. But the building exists. I just turned it into a jazz club to suit my needs. You can visit the locations, including Platform 101, and even follow the route that Kat takes at the end of the book from the Natural History Museum on the Upper West Side through Central Park down to Grand Central. But it's quite a hike, so if you do it, pace yourself. So those are all of the books that I have published to date. Sycamore Lane, Inland, and the 5-book Elixir Vitae Adventures series. All of them are young adult novels. Now, I make no secret of the fact that I write about things that scare me. Some of those things are obvious, like ghosts, for example, and some are less so. They're obvious to me, but maybe not to others, and I'm fine with that. In my books, my characters have to get past their own fears, be they ghosts or murderous doppelgangers or what have you. Writing these kinds of stories, I'm hoping that they help me overcome some of my fears, some of my worries, some of my anxieties. And that has been true, but I still have a lot more to write. I will continue to write about things that scare me. It's what I do, and that's probably never going to change. Unless, of course, I wake up one day and find that I am no longer afraid of anything. But I'm pretty sure if that happens, it's the subject for a whole different kind of book. For now, however, I'm still writing mysteries and thrillers, and I have a number of stories in the works. I'll tell you a little bit about my next book, which will come out this year. In 2024, I am switching gears just a bit. I will be publishing my first adult novel. It's a mystery titled A Place for Good and Evil. The book is set in St. Augustine, Florida, and it features 2 main characters. The first is Sydney Stone. One night, 3 years ago, Syd's entire life changed forever. She had been a wife and mother one minute, and the next she wasn't. Now, in a half-hearted attempt to rebuild her 40-something-year-old life, Syd lives in her friend Bert's garage apartment and has just hung out her shingle as a private investigator. So far, however, her cases have consisted solely of finding lost pets. The other main character is Leo, a 15-year-old boy who can see and talk to dead people. But he tries to avoid doing so if at all possible. The one spirit Leo would like to see, but hasn't yet, is his father's, whose death a year ago hit Leo and his mom very hard. Since everyone grieves in mysterious ways, Leo finds himself dropped off on his grandfather Bert's doorstep, while his mom tries to run from her grief by becoming a travel blogger. Soon after Leo arrives in St. Augustine, Bert arranges for him to help Syd with her new PI business. There's only one problem. Neither Syd nor Leo wants any part of that arrangement. A big case is hand-delivered to Syd by the sheriff of St. Johns County, and Syd and Leo reluctantly agree to team up, mostly for lack of anything better to do. Syd and Leo soon find themselves embroiled in a mystery that hits very close to home, the mystery of what really happened to Syd's husband and young daughter. Solving that mystery will require Syd and Leo to ask for help from both the living and the dead. I grew up in Florida, and I now live in St. Johns County, very close to St. Augustine. It's a small town, and while it's a tourist location, it still retains that small town feel. One of its nicknames is the Old City, which I use in the book. and it is an ideal setting for quirky characters, political corruption, and the macabre. Founded in 1565 by Spanish explorers, St. Augustine is hailed as the oldest continuously inhabited European established city in the United States. It is also rumored to be filled with ghosts and haunted locales. As such, it draws a lot of tourists. Locally, it is jokingly referred to as a drinking town with a history problem. So you can see why it's just ripe for stories. Since I set this book near where I live, I want to stress that I took a lot of liberties with this story. After all, it is a work of fiction. The characters are not based on real people, and any seemingly similar mysteries or scandals that may have occurred in the city's long history are strictly coincidences. The ghosts are not real either. At least, I don't think they are. I did try to accurately portray St. Augustine, its streets, landmarks, monuments, historical sites, and its general vibe. If you've never visited St. Augustine, you should. In the meantime, you could read my book if you want a glimpse of what St. Augustine is really like. A Place for Good and Evil will be the first book in a series that will follow main characters Sid and Leo. You won't need to read them in order, as the mystery in each book will stand alone. But reading them in order will give you a chance to see the characters grow and evolve over the course of the series. A Place for Good and Evil should be out in the first half of 2024. Unfortunately, as of the date of this episode airing, I don't have an exact release date yet. Sign up for my newsletter to receive details about the release date, as well as future books in the series and other books that I plan to write. You can find more information about me, my books, my writing journey, all that good stuff, including this podcast, on my website, staceyhoran.com, STACEYHORAN. You'll also find me on Instagram and Facebook under @StaceyLeeHoran. And my books are all available on Amazon in both paperback and ebook formats. Working on this podcast for the past 5 years has been a true joy for me. I've had the honor of meeting amazing authors, discussing wonderful books, and learning something new from each and every guest. This podcast has been part of my own writing journey, and the authors I have met through these interviews have made my journey that much richer. There are many more episodes to come, so please don't think this is the end. It is not. I have some fantastic authors lined up, and if I'm lucky, I'll be chatting with you again in my 300th episode. I want to thank my husband for coming up with the name for this podcast. He gets full credit for that. I also want to thank every author I have chatted with over the past 199 episodes. Thank you for your time, your enthusiasm for the craft, and your passion for doing something you love. Most of all, thank you to every listener who has downloaded episodes and listened to the authors, which now includes me, tell the story of their writing journey. It has been a privilege sharing this podcast with you, and I look forward to continuing to do so in the future. Thank you for listening, and I wish you luck on your own journey. The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.